Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's edition of TransitScreen Talks. We have with us David Zipper here to talk about data exchanges and urban mobility. Can everybody hear us okay? Before we get started, just want to make sure. Let's see. Yes. Awesome. And you guys will have an option to ask questions while David's talking, and he's going to talk for about 15 minutes here, and then we'll go ahead and do a little bit of a Q&A. So if anything comes to you, while he's talking, feel free to shout them out, and then we'll get to them at the end. All right. So let's go for it, David. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. And thanks for the opportunity. Thank you all for joining. Just a quick way of background. I have been working around cities and innovation for 20 years, partly in the public sector side, where I was executive director for NYC Business Solutions under Mayor Bloomberg. And then I led economic development strategy under two mayors in Washington, D.C. And I've been managing director at 1776, a large startup hub here in Washington, D.C., where I am now, for several years. And I left there just a few months ago, although I'm still involved with the venture fund there. I'm now a fellow at the German Marshall Fund, which is a think tank based in Washington and in Berlin, where I'm developing new programming there looking at European and American cities and how they're handling transportation questions. So it's a little bit about me. So to dive into the topic at hand, and again, just to reiterate, I'm going to share some thoughts, probably talk for roughly 15 minutes, and then would love to hear your ideas, your questions, and we can go from there. But this question or this issue of urban data exchanges sort of snuck up on me a little bit, really the beginning of this year, where I felt like it was becoming important. And I'd done a lot of work before around urban mobility with the ride-hailing companies, with Uber, with Lyft, with some of the private bike share companies. When I was in the mayor's office in DC is actually when not only Uber came to town, but also a company called Halo. There was no Lyft, but there was Halo. Uber came in and fought every regulatory battle under the sun with DC, while Halo gave a big bear hug to DC officials and invited all of us to their launch party. Halo is no more, was bought for like a penny on the dollar maybe by Daimler a little while ago, while Uber, the woman who was running Uber DC, Rachel Holt, and fought all those regulatory battles, now runs Uber North America. So it was just fascinating watching that whole drama play out. And then later in 1776, did a lot of work around urban mobility with city officials with the Smart City Challenge with Secretary Fox at USDOT a year ago, and started to appreciate there how startups are trying to use data like TransitScreen.
Yeah, I was going to say this is huge for us, really.
Really, a lot of various modes together, both public and private, to help people make decisions around mobility in cities. And at the beginning of this year, I was doing some work with Uber, and they asked if they could work with me in 1776 to launch a new product called Movement. Some of you probably have heard about Movement, but it was launched with great fanfare in January during the Transportation Research Board conference here in Washington. And I was the MC of the event. There were National League of Cities on a panel about it, as well as a bunch of sort of city leaders. And Movement, for those who may not be familiar with it, you can actually access it online now if you Google Uber Movement. But basically, in a nutshell, once you provide your information and show that you're registered with Uber, Uber will let you basically, at the census tract level, be able to basically plot for a given number of cities, a very limited number of cities, like Washington, Sydney, Manila, and just Johannesburg, and just a couple others. You can see for a given point in time how long it would take to get from this census tract, say in Washington, to that census tract in Arlington, Virginia. And there were some cool things that were shown about how to get data out of this for around when Metro here in Washington was undergoing some real problems. You could use Uber Movement to see how transportation times had changed. So this was Uber's way of saying, haha, we're not fighting with city officials anymore. Now we are giving you real information to help you make better transportation planning decisions. And I thought this was interesting, and I was curious what my friends on the public sector side would say. And so I talked with them, and the response I got from the National Association of City Transportation Officials and from people I know very well, like Scott Cooley, the head of Seattle Department of Transportation, was, "This is crap. This does not at all meet our needs." And it was really an eye-opening experience for me. And they explained all, like, some specific kinds of questions that city policymakers have that data is necessary to help them solve. That things like Uber movement, and to Uber's credit, at least they have something. Lyft, which these days has a better public reputation in many circles, has nothing like Uber movement that I'm familiar with, at least. So we should give Uber a little bit of credit there. But the response from the city officials was to say, this actually really is not what we need to make decisions that are around transportation infrastructure and policy that take into account the growing share of vehicle miles traveled in our core cities that are done on ride hailing, particularly Uber and Lyft, although you could apply this to other private forms of transportation too. In San Francisco right now, 20% of vehicle miles traveled are on Uber and Lyft. So it's intuitive that if you're trying to make decisions about around a particular corridor, or do you convert this particular curbside space that right now has a parking meter on it that raises $10,000 a year for the city, do you want to convert that to a ride-hailing pickup and drop-off point? That's a policy decision, but to make it in a data-driven way as a city leader, you need to know, okay, well, what's happening in terms of ride-hailing companies doing drop-offs around there? How much are they circling? Lots of questions that would go in that Uber movement doesn't have the specificity to provide. And NACTO, actually, people know, I mentioned this before, the National Association of City Transportation Officials put out a number of pretty harsh statements around Uber movement, and also put out a document that I believe we have a link to. Maybe we can bring that up real quick.
Yeah, let's pull
but
that up.
for those who are really wonky, you may want to check this out. And it's from earlier this year. It's called City Data Sharing Principles. And there it is. So this is basically city transportation officials saying, this is the kind of data that we need. And if you scroll down a little bit, that's it. You'll see the specifics. So what the city transportation officials are saying is, we need information for given corridors so we can make decisions about, about whether we want to do construction to reduce it by 1 lane or 2 on this street, or what's been the effect of our road diet. We want information by corridors around speed and volume of travel. We want information around safety, to be able to tell when ride-hailing cars are speeding up or slowing down suddenly. That's a sign that there could be an issue going on there. And there's questions of equity too, which would be, for example, if you are an African-American resident of a city who's downloaded a ride-hailing app, are you more likely to have to wait to get picked up compared to someone who's not African-American? Right now, Uber movement doesn't let you address any of these questions. And to be fair, at least there is something out there, at least in Washington, this very small handful of cities that Uber movement is available for. If you're looking at Lyft or other companies, there's nothing like that at all. So to take a step back, I think that hopefully conveys why this question of ride-hailing data is one that's of real importance and growing importance to city officials, and why they're dissatisfied with what the Ubers and Lyfts of the United States, and to a large extent of the world, have provided. But I want to have some empathy and take a moment to talk about why ride-hailing companies don't just give cities all of this data, because I think they have some valid points. And for those of us who feel like, look, I'm not even going to take sides here, but something has to give if we want better policy making decisions to be made, it's important to understand the perspective, I think, of the ride-hailing companies. And I'm fortunate to know a number of people in policy making decisions at Uber and Lyft and a few of these other companies. I've talked with them about it. And if you talk with them, they have empathy. And they recognize that if they're making requests, like, please do convert that curbside space from a parking meter into a drop-off and pick-off point for ride-hailing, you need data to make that kind of a decision. But they have a number of concerns about handing over data. First of all, there is a perception with the ride-hailing companies that in government, people don't even necessarily know what they want the data for, but they have a tendency to simply say, look, just give us everything, Uber, Lyft, or whomever, and we'll just figure out what we want to do with it. And having been within government myself, I could see how that could be true. When you don't fully understand something in government and there's a new type of data being created, you're as an official, because you're risk averse by and large, your likely reflex is to say, well, just give me all the data. So that way I know I have what I may need in the future. And the problem is, as Uber or Lyft officials will tell you if they're honest, is that even if they handed over that data, the city officials don't know how to use it. They're going to need a lot of hand-holding to even do the kinds of analyses to answer the questions they might want to pose. And the ride-hailing companies don't have the capacity to do that kind of technical assistance or guidance, even if they did hand over all that data. And that's a critique you'll hear over and over again that I think has some validity. Then there's the issue of privacy, which is also a real one. If you look at Uber Movement, there'll be certain census tracts where you will not be able to see any rides from that census tract to a given other location in Washington or Manila or Johannesburg. And the reason for that is that Uber is concerned that you could conceivably deduce who took that ride because there weren't enough rides to provide anonymity. An understandable concern, because if you or Joe Smith in a city feels like Uber might reveal your identity for a given trip, then you wouldn't want to take Uber or Lyft or whatever other company it might be. So privacy concerns are taken very seriously by these companies, and they're very wary of handing over data that could potentially reveal particular rides that people took. There's competitive pressures, like Lyft doesn't want Uber or vice versa to know, in all likelihood, where they might be gaining market share within an area. So if Lyft is starting to take market share in let's say the Adams Morgan weekend pickup market, you can imagine Uber respond, but they realize that Uber might respond by targeting incentive deals or free rides to people leaving the bars on a Friday or Saturday night. And there's a concern that through FOIA or some other request, that's the Freedom of Information Act, that if data from these ride-hailing companies was given over to the government, then somehow some of that information that's proprietary could become public in a way that damages the competitiveness of one of these companies. And then the last point, which is uneasy, frankly, but is a real one as a disincentive to hand over the data, is that if all this data was available for analyses from the ride-hailing companies, from the private transportation companies within cities, there could be some very uncomfortable questions that get asked, like that one I raised earlier about longer pickup times for people who are minorities. That is a very uncomfortable conversation for any company in this business to have in public. And I would argue it's an extremely important one from a public policy perspective, but you could understand or the hesitation, at least, I guess, of the transportation companies that wonder, well, wait a minute, am I going to end up with some sort of horrible headline on the newspaper that catches me off guard? So I'll say some of these responses from the ride-hailing companies I think have more merit and value than others, but collectively they explain, in my view at least, why you've not seen these companies basically say, oh sure, Seattle, Denver, San Francisco, so forth and so on, here's all the information that you're asking for. So where does that mean that we are now? And I just want to give a quick sense there, and I'd love to hear your questions and your thoughts. And I should make clear too, I don't pretend to be a technological expert in this space. I think it's a really important area, and it's one that I find really interesting, and I've done some writing about it. I think it was seen in the publicity for this. I wrote an article in the Atlantic City Lab about these sorts of data exchanges and ride-hailing data in the public purpose. And if you're interested in learning more, you might want to check out that article. But where are we now? It's kind of a standoff, right? You've got cities that keep asking for the data, and you've got ride-hailing companies that either aren't providing it or they're providing it in a format like Uber Movement that cities, by and large, with a couple exceptions, like Washington, D.C. actually does use Uber Movement, they don't feel as satisfying. I know NACDO does not feel, speak on behalf of city transportation officials throughout the United States, that Uber Movement satisfies their needs at all. And meanwhile, you've got this growing share of private transportation trips out of overall trips in an urban core that are effectively a black box for transportation planning. And here in Washington, in the last 2 weeks, many of us have seen all of these private dockless bike share bikes pop up on the streets all over the place, which is cool. But it's not at all clear to me that rides taken on those bikes are going to be brought into the overall DC Department of Transportation database for transportation planning in the way that the city's official city bike share program is. It's just another example saying as this share of the overall transportation pie that's private grows, it creates a question of information that's not available to cities. So what can move forward? What are some possible ways that this situation could be resolved? One is simply do nothing and let the private companies do what private companies want to do. That is actually a couple comments to my article in City Lab suggested that people from Silicon Valley who don't trust government to get anything right. As a former public official myself, I do not share that perspective. I think that if we do nothing, I worry about how we can have the kinds of technocratic, optimized planning decisions that we all want, and also how we can address some of these societal goals that we all share, such as, it's illegal for a taxi to pass an African American person to pick up a white person. We don't want that to happen for ride-hailing companies, at least I'm assuming that all we would be agreed in that. And without data, we won't know if it's happening or not. So one possible solution here, so that's one option, is just do nothing. Another option is to just demand it, to have laws passed in cities or that just require Uber and Lyft to hand over the data. And I'm very skeptical that will work for a couple of reasons. One is I'm not sure it would end up being in standardized format that would make it useful for doing analysis across cities, which would certainly be much, much, much better for everybody involved. But also I could see states, which are largely more business friendly than cities these days, preempting efforts by cities to mandate the provision of that data. I just think it's not going to go anywhere. So where does that leave us? And I think a likely scenario and a potentially fruitful direction to explore is to think about a third-party repository for this data, like a data exchange, if you will. And this is what I wrote about in the City Lab article, if you want to know more about it. But the idea could be to find a trusted third party that would take in data from both public and private sources, from a Lime bike and bike share company, as well as an Uber, as well as a transit agency, anonymize all the data in a trusted way, and then basically make that information available to researchers, to companies, to public officials to do the kinds of analyses that they want, and actually provide the technical assistance to help those researchers and officials answer the questions that they have. There are some examples of this being done in aviation with the federal government, and in cardiology, actually, with a large association that does it. To me, that could be a very interesting direction to go in, where you could basically make it sustainable by having companies basically pay for the right to do analyses, and maybe the governments would pay some sort of a light membership fee. There's a lot of talk about what a center like this could look like. I know that some of the large technology companies are working on the back end capabilities to be able to take in lots of massive big data sources that would be required. And I actually, in one of the interesting efforts along these lines is something called the Open Transportation Partnership, which is an initiative of the World Bank. I think we have a link of that we can show you, or a headline for it. The Open Transport Partnership, was launched by the World Bank in less than a year ago. And with this kind of goal in mind of being a sort of trusted third party to take in a lot of data. Now, I actually, and NACTO, I should mention, is partnering, is a part of this Open Transport Partnership. I have a lot of questions about this. You'll see with the launch that a number of international companies that provide transportation were part of it, but not the gorillas, Uber or Lyft. And I frankly don't know what the incentive is for Uber or Lyft to take part in it at this stage, because I feel like you might need a stick as well as a carrot to induce them. But this type of a model of a third party, I think, could be interesting. And I also know of a few startups that are actually themselves thinking about whether they could provide some sort of like a repository information on their own. Although my question I have about that model is, are they trusted enough in the way that a university or an association or a think tank would be to be neutral and to keep that very proprietary data private? So, so those are some. That's what sort of where things stand at the moment. And I guess the last point I'll make is, on that note, is it's really important as well that if we think about what a solution to this question is going to be, it needs to be something that's standardized across cities, because otherwise the companies that are active in multiple cities will have a tough time submitting it in different formats, not just Uber or Lyft, but imagine GM's Maven or Chariot with Ford or companies like that. And the question of what that standard is going to look like is going to be really important, and has not really been developed yet. And this is one of the critiques, by the way, of Uber Movement, is that you can download information from it in CSV format, but good luck trying to plug that in with anything else you might be getting from your city. It's standalone, which makes it far less valuable. So I'm going to end it there. But I guess just looking ahead, I just want to make one point to take a big step back as a former public official, someone with a think tank now. I really do think like doing nothing is not an option, and it's going to become more and more apparent it's not an option, because it's sometimes, I think, possible to take for granted the public purpose behind public transportation. Many of you who are wonks in this space will know that the New York subway and most transportation heavy rail systems in this country were initially private, and they were brought in to be public in the 60s during suburbanization. But there's a reason they're public. They've been public because they provide social goals, whether it's reducing congestion, whether it's reducing pollution, or it's providing equity benefits or mobility options for people who can't afford to move around a city. And I think to be able to, those are goals not just of, say, the metro or the New York subway, but of an urban transportation system that all of us want to see in our cities. And as more trips become private instead of public, we have to, I think, be able to rely on data to ensure that the collective system that we have, which TransitScreen is helping us navigate, that's going to include public sources of transportation as well as a whole cornucopia of private options, can get us there. Without data, we're just going to be wandering in the dark. I'll stop there. I'd love to hear what questions you may have, and we'll go from there.
Awesome. Yeah, David, thank you. That was, I think, gave everybody a lot to think about, and was a great overview of kind of where we are now. I know I have some thoughts, but we have a question here. And guys, if you have any questions at all, we'll be answering them. You can ask them here. We've got one from Jason. David, what about establishing as a quasi-public, state-chartered, city-controlled entity? That way you preserve public trust, but also provide some freedom for entity to operate between public, private, and community.
So let me actually.
Yeah, you can read that.
So I'm going to actually read this one more time.
We'll go right up.
What about establishing a quasi-public, state-chartered, city-controlled entity? That way you preserve public trust, but also provide some freedom for the entity to operate between public, private, and community. Possibly. I think you're getting, like, it's interesting. At the state level or the local level, I would worry about interoperability and consistency of format, like I was talking about earlier. You wouldn't want, say, Ford Smart Mobility, which runs Chariot, as well as some other services like a bike share service, to have to offer completely different data standards, or have to adhere to completely different data standards in Nevada as compared to Ohio, as compared to New York. So that's where I get wary about these sort of state and local efforts. But a natural response to that would be, well, is there some sort of federal government role? And my answer there is, I don't know. What I can tell you is that the Federal Transit Administration, FTA, is looking into that and is curious and interested. My personal sense is that I would be pleasantly surprised if the DOT under President Trump did something that creative and forward-looking at a time when, if I'm not mistaken, the president's initial budget completely got rid of the FTA. But at least in theory, the idea of a federal solution to this is intriguing. And perhaps there's ways of providing a carrot or a stick at the federal level to nudge the private companies to share their data in the way that that the federal government actually sort of pushes hospitals to share all of their data about the success of or lack thereof of particular operations and treatments, so that it can be collected together and allow researchers to optimize, say, oncological interventions for people with XYZ conditions. That's one example of it.
Awesome. And I guess a question I have is, you mentioned they would offer all of the data, and then we wouldn't really know what to do with it. Is there any that they could offer that you think might be not most important, but, if we aren't going to get everything, at least we'd have this?
I mean, honestly, no. I think that, if you look at that standard that NACDO provided of the data that they want, those are pretty reasonable public policy oriented questions that they want to answer. And I don't think that being able to answer that question or about whether to, convert a parking meter at curbside to a drop-off point, but not answer the question of whether there's a delay in picking up African Americans who use ride hailing is okay. I think you've got to be able to do both. And I actually am not sure that how much you can really negotiate on that side.
All right, we'll read Mike's question here.
Yeah, let me try. We're ad-libbing here. I'm going to try reading the question myself. Mike asks, you said you were wary of state and local-based repositories because of the lack of standardization, but national or international standards can be established that local repositories can use. GTFS comes to mind as an example. It's a good point. From Transit, what do you think of that approach? Common standard distributed repositories seems more likely than a national repository. Maybe, it's a good point. For GTFS, that certainly has become the standard. I guess the way I think it, and I'm sort of thinking out loud here, but GTFS really didn't have that was really more of a grassroots effort, I guess. It was Portland, Oregon that did it, and then other cities sort of followed along because they wanted to be part of this, to be really part of Google, right? So, perhaps. I think that's something that I'd be curious to explore more of. And keep in mind, too, I guess a question that I have in all of this is how do you make it sustainable? Because this is going to be expensive. Someone's going to have to anonymize this data in a way that I don't think was the same kind of issue with GTFS, where you're basically just looking at real-time information for transit arrivals, departures, and all of that, schedules. So when you have costs, you've got to have revenue. And where's the revenue going to come in from? I don't know that foundations are going to be able to have enough at scale to do this. So I become really interested in the question of whether it's local or national, are you going to charge the companies to be able to access the data and do the kinds of analyses they want? And if so, how much? The few examples of efforts to do this I'm aware of, like the World Bank Initiative, are foundation-based, and I'm not sure that's going to be sustainable in the long run.
Yeah, especially, for us at least, with the Dockless bike shares that are here, people have asked us if we're going to be showing that on the screens. And obviously right now we can't because we don't have the data for, how many bikes are there or where they are or anything like that. And we've reached out to those companies and some of them have said, we're small, we're just starting up, and we, haven't been able to make GBFS in that case. For the bike share, we haven't been able to do that yet. So I guess part of it is also, giving them a reason to make that a priority in terms of like the funds that they have too.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's a question. Stefan from Where's My Transport asked a phantom question. Oh, no, here. Sorry.
There's the first
now
one.
I see it. Thanks for mentioning South Africa. You're welcome, Stefan. Stefan, I believe, is calling in from Cape Town. And I mentioned it because Johannesburg is one of the cities you can use it for movement with. Given the topic of the chat is data sharing, are we assuming that recipients of the data should only be public authorities? What about various enterprises sharing data with each other as a service? Any thoughts on Uber's recent move toward first to last mile integration? Uber riders being able to visualize public transport options powered by Citymapper, for example. So let me, first of all, great question in terms of, and this is what I'm going to focus on in the interest of time, but assuming questions about whether recipients of the data should be public authorities. By all means, I think you should be accredited and identified to do the kinds of analyses with the anonymized data we're talking about here. But by all means, I think it should not just be public authorities. I would hope that, like, keep in mind, Uber and Lyft would love to be able to understand how people are moving around in an anonymized way in a given city. And I think they should be able to have that opportunity, maybe pay for it in a way that allows for the program to exist. But I think that's fine. I think academic researchers should have an opportunity to use it. And I think startups should have an opportunity to use it as well. How that pricing scheme, what that pricing scheme looks like, I'm not sure. And I think there's a lot of models we have to think about, but this should be a democratizing project in my mind. And I absolutely think that it should be available to anyone who basically registers with this exchange service, if you will, and goes from there. Now, one question I also don't know the answer to would be whether it's better to have people from, say, Ford Smart Mobility or Where's My Transport, where Stefan works, be able to do the analysis themselves online, or if they basically have to work with a researcher at a university who is skilled in the data set to answer the question that they pose. I could see merits on both sides, and it needs to be figured out.
Awesome. And I know you offered a couple of options as to, where we go from here, what might be the best case scenario. Is there anything that you think is maybe the most likely scenario?
Yeah,
and I know it's a hard question.
Yeah,
but,
no,
I think no one really knows. But
no, I mean, what's interesting is, so I wrote this article with CityLab because I was just really curious about this topic, and I felt like it's something that I kept hearing about a lot from both the private side and the public official side, and I frankly thought it was a pretty wonky topic. I wasn't sure it was going to get much of a response at all because the article came out on July 3rd, right before July 4th. No one's going to read this thing. And lo and behold, I got a lot of people both like attacking me and saying, oh, this is really interesting and really important. And it was way more it bounced around a lot more than I ever expected. And in the wake of that article, I've learned about, I think at this point, 6 or 7 different initiatives, both private and public, to create this kind of an exchange. So what I think, to answer the question, I think the most likely scenario is this issue is going to keep ricocheting and gaining attention in the next 6 months to 2 years. And you're going to see a number of different efforts to provide that exchange. It's like everybody wants to be a platform in startups. Everybody wants to be this exchange to an extent. And then it'll shake out. I think in 2 years from now, there will be a dominant platform. But I think first you're going to see a bunch of people sort of clamoring to be in that space.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think
should pause and end it there.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. David, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody, thank you for joining us as well.
Can I make one final point?
Yeah, please.
Just like, and again, like I'm personally really interested in this topic. It's one that I suspect there are people who are calling in, who are listening in, who frankly worked in it, particularly on a technological side, much deeper than I have. If you have thoughts, I'd love to hear what you're thinking about. And you can reach me on Twitter at David Zipper, or you can shoot me an email. I think my address is available on the German Marshall Fund site, or frankly, just do it my personal account, whatever. It's a friendly crowd, davidzipper@gmail.com. But I'd love to hear what you're thinking about with it.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your week.